Incorporating information into your own work is the other half of the research process. The goal of this workshop is to help you identify when and how to use a direct quote, including giving credits through citations, so that everything is successfully and ethically incorporated. You have to find sources of information and identify key sentences or paragraphs or ideas from them, and then you have to make use of them, deciding along the way exactly how you're going to do that. Your goals are to synthesize what you're reading so that you're making a new final product with everything. Use that information ethically by giving credit and not overusing it, and to make everything flow together smoothly in your own voice. Our first big important idea here is to understand that quotes are a way of borrowing both the exact words as well as the ideas from somebody else. That may seem pretty obvious, but I just want to set up the contrast to paraphrasing, which borrows ideas without words. The next big important idea, even though we're here to specifically discuss direct quoting, it is honestly less important than paraphrasing. Your instinct should be to paraphrase and not quote in your final work. There are exceptions, of course, and that depends on different disciplines and the sources you're using and what you're trying to accomplish. Primary sources, whether that's a novel for English class or a law for government, often makes sense to quote since you're directly engaging with that work. You should also pay attention to the way the author of your source uses language. If they're coining a new phrase or a label for something that you're repeating in your work, then that's something to at least initially place in quote marks because it is unique to that source and that author. If something is just really beautifully or impactfully written and paraphrasing would lessen the impact, then of course that's something you'd want to quote as well. However, in all honesty, those situations are rather few and far between. So let's say you have one of those situations where you feel justified in quoting. What should you do? First of all, anytime you're repeating anything word from word from your source material, those words must be inside quotation marks to indicate, again, that you are borrowing the words as well as the ideas. Even if you have a citation at the end, if you leave off the quote marks, you are committing plagiarism because you're implying that the words are yours. That's not to say that you can't make changes, they just have to be marked in a particular way. So we've got the square brackets where we are changing verb tenses or maybe adding clarifying details, or cutting out sections with the ... ellipsis mark to make things flow into your paper better. Ultimately, you're trying to quote just the minimum. You don't have to use the entire sentence, and typically you should not use it. There are some phrases that are going to be more important than others within a sentence. Those are what you quote. Like the images on the slide, we can still get a clear idea of the concept with using very few pieces of that original. On the left, we've got the full detailed photograph. Each subsequent image, we're removing some detail, removing some detail. The meaning, the message of those images remains consistent, but we can accomplish the same thing using many fewer lines or many fewer words. You want to keep the total number of quotes that you use to a minimum over the entirety of your paper, but if you're following our best practices in other ways, like keeping your quotes short, you shouldn't have to worry about that too much. The examples on this slide illustrate how to tweak your quotes to make them work for you better. Where we've got our original line, we've excised some of that with the ... and if it makes more sense to say there instead of your, we can still bring that in as a quote, but it's marked with these square brackets to indicate a change. That full quote is surrounded by our own words, our paraphrasing of that rest of that context as well. So that note, framing that quote. So that framing, that buffering, we want to frame our quotes by leading into it as part of the same sentence, possibly with a signal phrase as simple as this person wrote, to let our reader know that a quote is coming. It can also follow out with your own words, providing some analysis or that other context, because again, we want to keep just the most important parts of the quote in our own works. We want to avoid having a completely standalone quote all by itself because it's robbed of that other supporting context that helps it fit in with your own writing, your own argument, and your own ideas. On that note, that means your quotes are often still going to include paraphrases. It's not strictly either or, it's often both. Again, paraphrases are generally preferred over quotes, so even when you are incorporating quoted information, you should still find yourself employing paraphrases as well. For example, I've got two ways of quoting on this slide. In my good quote, I have just a very short phrase highlighted in yellow. The rest of this statement is all information that came from my source, indicated with this parenthetical citation. The only exact word-for-word phrase that I used are this middle section here. In my bad quote, this is kind of the worst case scenario. I took the entire 2 sentences from my source, pasted it into my slide, and I've still got the citation down here. I've given credit, but imagine a paper where you have done this style of quote over and over and over and over. The vast majority of your paper is not going to be considered original because just piecing together quotes is not the same as actively synthesizing information. You're just being an editor at that point, rather than truly authoring a paper. So we want our minimal quote buffered by paraphrasing either of the source or possibly our own analysis. We want to avoid big standalone quotes like this. Now let's say you do have a really juicy quote that you want to use a lot of, possibly one of those beautifully stated sections like we talked about earlier. If it runs over 4 lines of your paper, you're going to format it a little bit differently than a regular quote. This is known as a block quote because it forms this extra little square section further indented from the edges of your paper. Just note that this does exist as an option. If you have a very long quote, this is the format you should use. But also, you should not be using this block quote very much, especially if you're writing a 5-page or less paper. You should have 0 of these. Even a 10-page paper, you can maybe have 1, 2 at the most. We want to be doing minimal quotes. Just to provide a couple more examples from the wild and actual published work, on top we can see where a source was quoted as a fragment, again with a ... to indicate that the original sentence kept going, but the author didn't need it, so they just left it after those handful of words. The second example has a separate sentence that provides the context for the quote, so it doesn't all have to be packed together necessarily into one sentence, but you still want to have that buffer, and you still want to make sure that every time you're quoting, you are attaching your own words to that idea, preferably not just a restatement or summary of the quote that your reader would have just read for themselves. You're trying to bring something new, you're trying to anchor that quote to your own work. As mentioned before, wherever you have a quote, you need to provide a citation to give credit. The exact look will depend on the citation styles you're using, of course. Some quick examples of the big 3. In MLA, our most familiar one, we have our quote with our short signal phrase, quotation mark, quote, quotation mark, parentheses, author last names, page number, close parentheses, period at the end. Because quotes are very specific pieces of information, there should typically be a page number or a timestamp in your parenthetical citations. In APA, pretty similar to MLA, we just include that year of publication in there, and once again we do see that we get a page number attached for a quote. Lastly, Chicago gets a little bit more complex. Overall, you'll be using footnotes for your citations rather than parentheses. Since your class is with us, we'll typically have you using Chicago Notes Bibliography style. We will still have specific page numbers in the footnotes since they are functioning as in-text citations. There's situations where parenthetical citations can be used, but we're not going to get into that here. Just mentioning it. that is our rundown of best practices for quotes. Don't do too many. Keep them short when you do use them. Paraphrasing is generally preferred, and quotes will be buffered by paraphrases anyway, so paraphrasing is going to be your main tool, and always, always, always have a citation for those quotes. If you have questions, we have resources online to guide you in plagiarism best practices and citations. Plus, of course, you can always talk to the librarians or the writing coaches to get more assistance on how to improve your writing in this way. Thank you so much for all your time, and have a good day. Happy researching!